Hello everybody, and this game I'm about to show you was played last night between myself and Neil Tomkin in a Middlesex League match. Neil is rated about 150 ECF, although he has been higher, I think mid 160s at one point. So not to be he's not a player to be taken lightly. You have to play very accurately against these types of players to make sure that you win. I was white, and the time control was 75 minutes for the first 30 moves, with 15 minutes added on to complete the game. I played my usual c4, knight f6, g3, c5. So here this is known as the symmetrical English when black responds with c5. And usually if black can keep the symmetry for a while, then white's advantage is at best minimal, at worst non-existent. So after bishop g2 and knight c6, in this type of English you always have to play knight c3, so I may as well get on with it and play knight c3. And here I felt he made a slight error, because if he wants to keep the symmetry, as in a symmetrical English, g6 is probably best, and I would probably have to allow the symmetry with knight f3, bishop g7, and the book move is d4, breaking the symmetry early, and usually after knight takes, queen takes, you get an interesting position where normally white double fianchettos and black sets up a dragon Sicilian type structure, and the exchange of minor pieces favours black, although white's advanced pawn on c4 allows white a small space advantage. So generally play goes d6, queen d3, knight d7, b3, castles, bishop b2, knight c5, and usually after knight c5, queen c2, and white is going to castle kingside, and black is going to try and create some pressure, or play a type of hedgehog formation. So you get interesting games here from this position. This has been played many times, but this did not happen in the game. Just going back to the main game. So g6 would have led to that position. That would have been fairly equal, but instead he played d6, which allows me to break the symmetry very early with knight f3, now g6, but I have d4. So I think that bishop g7 is the best move here, and as white I would probably play d5 just to try and break with e4 and e5 coming up. Taking the pawn on c5 would mean an equal pawn structure, a symmetrical pawn structure, and an equal position. Although I could play a move like e3 if he played bishop g7. But instead he took, and now I took, and he could just transpose back into the main line with knight takes d4, queen takes, and bishop g7, which is what I was expecting here. But instead he played the unusual, but not bad, bishop d7 here. Interesting move. It should be noted that although taking my knight and queen takes and then bishop g7 transposes, he can't play bishop g7 because I win with knight takes c6 after captures, bishop takes, and I'm going to win the exchange and the pawn. So the two choices are really knight takes knight or bishop d7. So here there's an idea of trying to play bishop c6 to challenge my bishop on g2. Perhaps he could play knight takes knight, queen takes knight, and then bishop c6. So I felt, though, that if he did that, my development might allow me to have an advantage. So I castle and bishop g7. And here I don't really see anything better than playing e4. So here we've gone into a Sicilian defense, a Maroczy bind structure, which I will do a video on at some future point. The Maroczy bind is characterized by white having two pawns on c4 and e4, and usually having a knight on the d4 square. So this allows white a space advantage, but on the other hand, white does have weak dark squares, and also the pawns can possibly become targets later on for black's pieces. And black has a slight deficit in space, but has a very solid, compact structure, and there are lots of very good squares for his pieces. So this is seen as being double-edged, as draws aren't really seen in this type of position. Normally one side is doing better than the other. So Neil played castles, which is probably the best move on the board. I can imagine some of you might look at knight takes e4 here, which always has to be considered when you play as white, but here it doesn't work. If I take his knight on e4, then he does win the pawn after recapturing on d4, but I can play knight takes knight, and the best move is for him to copy me. Knight takes knight, knight captures the queen, knight captures the queen, knight takes b7. So if we look at this position for a moment, it's completely equal on material, but his knight on d1 is a bit trapped. And the best move for black is knight takes pawn, bishop takes, rook b1, rook a b1, bishop e5, and now I can win the exchange with knight takes d6, bishop takes, and bishop takes a8. So here I'd calculated it to this point, and I felt that I should quite easily be able to win this game, being the exchange up for nothing. So there's often a tactical sequence that you have to calculate for both sides if you reach this type of position. So he did castle, and now in the Maroczy bind, because black is going to be rather cramped and will have less space, I want to keep the pieces on. I don't want to exchange. So I play knight c2. Knight b3 is also a good move. And my idea is just to slowly develop and eventually try and push the pawns up to the 4th rank. And maybe eventually push with c5 or e5 later on. Queen c8. So he's planning to exchange by playing bishop h3 and then bishop takes bishop. So I get my rook off the f1 h3 diagonal with rook e1. Sure enough, bishop g4 first is played to try and make my queen look silly and put it on a bad square. I play f3, and now the bishop continues on its journey to h3. And the reason I played rook e1 was to allow this move to become possible. Bishop h1. If my rook had been on f1, I'd have lost the exchange. So here, his bishop on h3 and my bishop on h1 are slightly out of action, but that's fine for me. The longer the game goes on, the more likely it is that my bishop on h1 will prove to be monstrous along the long diagonal. So again, the retreat and the lack of exchanges favours white. Here, though, I thought he made a slight inaccuracy where he developed, but instead I think he should play knight e5, targeting the c4 pawn. That's quite thematic in this type of position. And we would get a very complicated position with b3 to defend. Now maybe knight f to d7, and the idea is to come into c5, and perhaps the two knights could converge on d3. Also, the knight on e5 could move away and attack the knight on c3 with the bishop on g7. So knight d5, rook e8 to stop knight e7 check, knight f4 going after black's bishop, knight c5, and I hadn't calculated much beyond here in the game, but the computer gives a rather crazy looking line of g4, knight takes bishop, bishop takes rook, pawn takes knight, and bishop c3, with white playing rook f1. And here, if we look at this position, what's interesting is that black is a pawn up and has the rook, so he's got a rook and a pawn, but white has a knight and bishop. So it's equal on material, but I would think white is doing a lot better because of two pieces are usually better than one piece. Also, the rook on the f-file is a bit dangerous, as well as perhaps queen d5 or queen f3 could be played in a moment, attacking f7. And the bishop on c1 is ready to spring to life, whereas black's pieces on the back rank are a little bit difficult to make into strong attacking forces, it's difficult to coordinate them. So that was an interesting line. I don't think this line is all forcing, so I still believe knight e5 is stronger than what was played. Rook d8 was played, and this allows me a slight breather where he's not really attacking anything, so I can continue development with bishop e3, knight e5 now, and b3. So at this point, I was thinking that I was fairly comfortable here. My plan is to play rook c1 to getting the rook off the long diagonal, and what black is often trying to do in a hedgehog, which I've done a video on, which you may want to look at, is black wants to play the freeing move d5, and sometimes b5 to allow for a queenside initiative. So my two pawns on e4 and c4 are clamping down on the d5 square, and I'm planning on playing queen e2 to have a queen, knight, and pawn all on b5, so that b5 is not playable for black. And once I've got his counterplay completely neutralized, I can then slowly push my pawns up the board. So I was feeling fairly confident here. Bishop d7, interesting move, and I play rook c1, bishop c6. So his bishop is now challenging my bishop on h1 in a way, but it also doesn't really seem to be threatening anything. So first I just play knight d4, so my knight is now centralized and I can pick off the bishop pair at my convenience. Queen d7. So he's connected the rooks. Queen and bishop are lined up, but they're not really able to move anywhere. And I felt here that I can pick off the bishop pair at any time. There's no reason to release tension just yet. Generally, if you keep the capturing possibilities open, you have lots of options for tactics. So I play queen e2, and again b5 is being scrutinized by four white pieces. It's going to be very hard for black to play b5. Rook a c8. And here I just decide to put my rook on d1 lining up with his queen. So there is a possibility of me breaking open the center with a move like c5. And if pawn takes, I have knight f5, unveiling the attack on the queen. And there are lots and lots of tactics going on there. But that's a possibility for the future, and I was hoping I could play it in a move or two. But instead, he played what I consider to be slightly inaccurate. I think b6 is strongest, just preventing my c5 thrust, and also, if I don't take the bishop pair now, he'll be able to play bishop a8. And I think I would capture his bishop if he played b6, and then play knight d5 next move. But instead, queen c7. And this move is a little bit weakening because I now can target one of his pawns. Unusual in the hedgehog, because usually all of black's pawns are incredibly well defended. But here I have knight c to b5, forking the queen and the a7 pawn. Here he has two reasonable moves with the queen. Both of them will result in the same thing. Queen a5 is far more active, and it was played. But now I actually have knight takes a7, forking the rook and bishop. So the obvious question is, what's wrong with queen takes a7? Well, if queen b8, knight takes, queen takes, we'd reach the same position whether you played queen b8 or queen a5. White has knight takes bishop, so currently material is even, apart from the fact that I've won the pawn, and the queen is being double attacked by the knight and bishop, so the queen has to move. And here I can either take the rook immediately, or I can be really, really nasty and take on e7 with check, and then take the rook on c8, which I would probably do. And I'd be 2 pawns up and the exchange up, so it's more or less game over at this point. So going back, after queen a5, knight takes a7, he didn't take the knight, he instead played rook a8. So there's some counterplay. You could argue that the rook and queen on the a file might be able to cause me some problems. But here I had an idea, and that idea was that if his knight on e5 wasn't on e5, if it moved away, I could capture twice on c6, and that would fork the queen and rook on a5 and d8. So I play f4 to force the knight away. Of course, I can play knight takes c6, but after the various captures, I somehow feel like black is still in this game. I'm a pawn up, and I do have the bishop pair, so I should win, but the game may go on a very long time, and I wanted to finish quickly. So I was trying to play precisely, and the computer does give f4 as the best move. Now, there are several options for black. None of them are very good. Let's go after rook takes a7. I do have knight takes c6, but even stronger is pawn takes knight. Pawn takes, knight takes bishop, rook takes rook check, rook takes, pawn takes knight, bishop takes rook, queen takes bishop check, and queen f2. So at this point in the game, black is just lost, if I'm honest. If you look at the material count, black is only a pawn down. I say only, but I've got a passed a pawn, which is going to be incredibly useful. And also being the exchange down doesn't really help either. So white should fairly convincingly win this from here. So rook takes a7, not such a good move. There's bishop takes e4 was the move I looked at in the game, which I thought might have been strongest. But I have the very simple pawn takes knight, pawn takes pawn, and knight d to b5. So I'm just defending my extra piece here. And okay, it might be a few moves before I can extract my extra piece from a7, but I don't think white has any real problems, and I should win fairly convincingly, being a piece up. So the only other move left to consider is the one played in the game, knight e to g4. And here I capture twice on c6. My opponent plays queen takes a2. So this is a very interesting position again. That's what I quite like about my games, is that I always get sort of crazy tactics as well as positional features in them. Here, I don't really want to play queen takes a2, because after rook takes, then I can win his rook on d8, but he has knight takes e3, and I was a little bit concerned that maybe he has compensation for the exchange, and he has a rook on the 7th, and I was a little bit concerned. So I played rook d2 to avoid exchanging queens and get his queen off the 7th rank. Queen a3, so I have to watch out for the rook on c1, and I defend my b3 pawn with rook b1. And here I didn't really mind that I wasn't going to win the exchange immediately, because if rook e8, I have e5, and that's going to target his a8 rook with my bishop on h1. So I still have lots of tactics, and I'm winning anyway on material. So here I wasn't concerned if he didn't let me have the rook, but he did with knight takes e3, and I then felt a little bit bold, and I think the safest move is just queen takes e3, but that's boring. I decided to take the rook. Just very briefly, if queen takes e3, rook e8, e5, knight g4, queen e2, and after queen c5 check, things just get quite complicated. After knight d4 and pawn takes pawn, I can win the exchange, he then takes the knight, but white is still winning. It's just, it's a little bit tricky with black having this passed pawn on d4, although I will admit I hadn't calculated this far ahead. I just thought that it was far easier to take the rook on d8 and be done with it. So queen c5 is a valiant attempt to get counterplay, and I obey the rule of if you have a passed pawn, then push it with b4. Queen takes c4, queen takes knight, and rook takes knight. So at this point I've given up the c4 pawn to exchange and make the position much more clear and simple to play. But I don't like the bishop on g7 having that long diagonal. I don't like it, so I prevent it with e5. Now I've got a fantastic pawn chain on h2, g3, f4, e5. His pawn on d6 is pinned, so he can't capture the pawn. His knight is threatened, and my bishop on h1 now controls the entire long diagonal. So I was pleased with this position. And he plays knight g4. I sidestep with queen d3. I'm more than willing to trade queens now. All I have to do is just trade and push my passed pawn, and the win should come fairly quickly. Queen c7, bishop f3. So finally my bishop has moved out of the corner, and I fully expected knight h6 here, and then I was planning on playing b5, b6, b7, b8, queen. But first he played queen b6 check, and what do you think I played here? Yeah, I want to trade, so queen d4. And as his knight and queen are both being attacked simultaneously, he has to trade queens and move the knight to safety. I push, knight f5, and I just want to prevent any knight moves, so rook d3. So I'm preventing knight d4 and knight e3, which could cause me problems in the future. Just preventing any kind of tactics for black. Rook b8, and now I just want to make the knight useless with g4, knight h4, and I don't really want to trade off my lovely bishop on e4, on f3 for the knight on h4, so after bishop e3 his knight cannot move anywhere. Takes, and it would be wrong of me to take the pawn because then his bishop's really centralized and it's controlling the b8 square where my pawn wants to be promoted to. So I play f5, pawn takes, and again his knight still cannot move anywhere. e6, and I think why not? I will double your pawns. And as long as I keep my bishop here, his knight cannot move without me trading it, because while I didn't want to trade it last time, I have got the extra tempo, b6, so I felt that here I wouldn't mind exchanging because it just allows me to keep on pushing the pawn. Bishop f8, threatening bishop c5 check. So he could even play rook takes b6 if it was his turn, and then after I take back on b6, he could play bishop c5, forking the king and rook. Very, very clever. So b7, bishop c5 check, and again I just want to avoid any tactics. I don't want to allow rook f8 check, so I just play king h1. Knight f5, and I trade. First though, I play rook c3. So here I've got the threat of rook c8 check, so his bishop needs to move to defend his rook. Rook d6, and I trade. And now the final killing blow is rook c6. Here his bishop can't move anywhere to protect that still protects his rook, and if he plays rook d8, I have rook takes bishop, and if he takes back, I then have b8 queen and forking the rook and king. So he played bishop f8 and resigned after I played rook c8. So next move, I'm either going to win a rook for a pawn after rook takes b7, rook takes b7, or I'm going to get a queen. So I thought this game was very positional at the beginning, and it was quite sort of strategic, but then it exploded into tactics. And I can't remember who said this. I don't know if who I'm quoting here, but they said that all tactics come from positional features. So at the beginning, it was all very slow and positional with the English symmetrical. Then went into the Maroczy bind. Again, very positional. And a lot of manoeuvring occurs, so piece play is very important in this opening. Mostly it's just about finding the best squares for your pieces. Here I felt black didn't do that well because the queen and rooks weren't very well connected early on. And you could argue I'm doing the same, but my pieces, minor pieces, just feel a little bit more coordinated and stronger than black's, as the bishop on g7 never really does anything until the last few moves of the game, and his knight on f6 and his knight on e5 are both preventing the bishop from having any scope. And after we connect our rooks and have our queens on good squares, I still feel that he's the one under pressure at this point. Again, b6 would have led to a totally different game with me having the bishop pair. But what's very, very tricky is if he plays b6, I still have knight takes. And I think the best move is knight takes knight, because if queen takes, I have f4 and then e5 coming along, and that would attack the knight on f6 and it would hit the queen on c6. So after he plays here, I can now break with I can now break with f4. And I just like this position. I don't even need to play f4 yet. I could save it another move and play knight d5 first. But I feel that white has a very strong position here. Yeah, maybe even knight d5 is stronger. But I just like this for white. Feels good. But black does have some chances if he can weather the storm and continue sort of playing passively and defensively and swap down to an endgame where then maybe black can take advantage of some of the weak squares that I've left behind by advancing the pawns. Anyway, I hope you liked this video, hope you got something from it. Comment, like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.